Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar at OEM's Transformation to a Model-Based Enterprise. My name is Rachel Casciato, and I will be your moderator for today's panel discussion. Before we get started today, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. Everyone attending the session today is in listen-only mode, but we'd like to hear from you through the questions box in your control panel or by tweeting us at @VertexVIS. We will be answering your questions at the end of the panel discussion today. Joining me today are two experts in the field of product development, engineering, and manufacturing, Jim Zwica and Nathan Hartman. Jim Zwica's experience in product lifecycle management and product development began in the 90s. Throughout his career, he has supported both OEMs and supplier organizations, helping companies understand how to best leverage their PLM tools and visualization capabilities throughout the extended enterprise. At Vertex Software, Jim helps support product initiatives. Nathan Hartman is the Dauch Family Professor of Advanced Manufacturing and Department Head of Computer Graphics Technology at Purdue University and Director of the Purdue University Product Lifecycle Management Center. Professor Hartman's research areas include the process and methodology for creating model-based definitions, examining the use of the model-based definition of the product lifecycle, and developing the model-based enterprise. Jim, Nathan, thank you so much for joining me again today and returning for another discussion.
It's good to be here again.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. Thank you.
So for those that weren't able to come to the session a couple weeks ago, a few weeks the three of us sat down in a very similar panel discussion to discuss the evolution of communication and collaboration in product development. For any attendees that may have missed that discussion or need a refresher, we started that by talking about the traditional view of product development, which was very face-to-face and based in 2D. Engineers would work together in the same building to develop trust and rapport, which then supported the design process. In the last several years, virtual and digital means are growing in use due to rapid advancements in technology. These tools enable more effective communication and greater feedback loops. Today, engineers still need the same kind of information to work and make decisions, but the way that the information is delivered and communicated has changed dramatically, enabling the use of concepts like the digital twin and the digital thread. We spent a lot of time discussing 3D modeling and how it's a much stronger way to communicate design intent, although there's still a lot of challenges in 2D versus 3D for both organizations and individuals. Leading into our conversation today, we will continue the conversation of where we are at in communication and collaboration within product development and how it relates to working with designs in 3D. So to start us out, I want to start by spending some time discussing the model-based approach. So, gentlemen, can you describe from your perspectives and experiences what is a model-based enterprise?
Sure, Rachel. So I think a model-based enterprise, from my perspective, is in some cases not a whole lot different than any other enterprise, right? You have functional areas of people working in different disciplines. You'll have infrastructure and organizational structure and process. You'll have products or services that you provide, but the key difference in the context of this conversation really has to do with how information is created and disseminated. In a model-based enterprise, people tend to use digital product data, digital process data, most of which is based on the use of a three-dimensional model as one of the communication channels that people use to share information with each other. So, for example, historically, if the design role was going to communicate with the production role, you might have a series of text-based documents as well as technical drawings. In a model-based enterprise, you may still have accompanying text-based documents, but you are more likely to share and use three-dimensional models back and forth between the two groups rather than two-dimensional and in some cases hand-marked drawings. So, a model-based enterprise, in my view, is really an organization that has chosen to work in a particular way using particular kinds of technologies and information artifacts.
Yeah, I would agree on that too. If you think back in the 90s when we rolled out the first virtual design review, virtual design process or digital prototyping tools or frameworks, the intention was for it to be enterprise-wide accessible. But due to various drivers, expense and learning curve and hardware expenses, that sort of thing, the solutions really only took off in a few few entities, and engineering for the most part, and then a little bit into the manufacturing space, but the rest of the enterprise has never aligned to the creation of this content. And so to me, a model-based enterprise would be a recognition that those other entities have been not engaged in this, and to see what do they need in order to make good decisions. And oftentimes that points to the model, and then aligning their world or their context or their specific information processes to that model so that they can use it in the way that was intended. And then also the entire enterprise can then really see in a nice way what everyone else is doing, but it's all aligned to that model itself.
So diving in a little bit deeper, we're talking about, at a high level, what that enterprise looks like. But we also hear things about the model-based definition. Can you guys please give a little bit of description around what a model-based definition looks like?
Yeah, sure. So from my perspective, a model-based definition really is this creation of a three-dimensional model that also includes all of, or as many are as necessary, notations, symbols, dimensions, other non-geometric information that goes with the model in such a way that it can fulfill the information requirements of the people who use it. That being said, one of the views of a more future-looking approach to a model-based definition is how that model-based definition relates to the digital twin. In our previous interview some time ago, we talked about what was a digital twin. And I suspect that in the future, a little ways out, we're not there yet in terms of technology or even adoption of the particular methods and tools that exist today. But in a future state, I could very much see this concept of a model-based definition and this concept of a digital twin becoming one and the same. Today, many organizations simply use a model-based definition, which is to say a 3D model with highlighted or viewable dimensions and notations. They simply use it as a proxy for a drawing. However, the technology that is used to create these definitions, as well as the advances that are coming in materials and behavioral definition and context definition, is, in my view, likely to bring this concept of a model-based definition and a digital twin certainly much closer together, if not make them become one and the same.
Yeah, I agree completely with Nate on this. And if you look backwards, so what information was required to engineer and then manufacture this part, this assembly, this design? It's a merging of the 2D drawing with the 3D model in a way that's consumable for whether it's a human or another machine or something like that, to make a decision that advances the design in the correct way, as the strategy would state. But also going in outside of the traditional users of this information, it's getting them into the game. It's getting their stuff either structured through metadata or through classifications, so that they are then not just having their information aligned, but there may be some proactive notification or engagement of them into the design process much sooner than exists today, because they are now part of this design, the digital twin or the digital thread flow.
And we're starting to see some transformation towards model-based approaches.
We're definitely seeing that transformation. Obviously, in some industry verticals and industry sectors, that transformation is farther along than in others, but certainly there is a definitive movement now, from what I've seen across manufacturing, not just here in the U.S. but globally, to make more use of that annotated model versus a drawing than we have in the past.
So as we're thinking about, this transformation, regardless of the industry, regardless if we're talking about manufacturing, product development, or other industries, as you mentioned, Nate, in our previous panel discussion, we had just started scratching the surface to talk about some of the barriers with 2D versus 3D, and how there's this kind of a bit of a clash or some hang-ups with transferring from 2D approaches to 3D. And how that is one of the barriers to going towards a model-based approach. And I wanted to talk with you about what some of the other common barriers are in an organization being able to transform into a model-based enterprise.
Well, I think certainly one of the key readily identifiable barriers has been around the ability, or in some cases the inability, to identify a particular business case. And as we think about developing a business case, I think it's important to take a step back and understand, when someone talks about a model-based definition, many people immediately in their mind think about the use of a 3D CAD model as some element of that model-based definition. And while I would certainly agree that is a piece of the puzzle, there is more to the model-based definition than just the geometric representation of the product or the process. In fact, there are plenty of different kinds of models that people can create that don't necessarily have a geometric representation associated to them. And so when someone or a group within a company sets out to get buy-in or to identify a business case around this use of model-based definition, it's important to really think about the picture that is in front of them as broadly as possible. Because not everyone in a group is going to think about, or not everyone in a company is going to think about a model as being the same thing. A model in its most basic sense is a representation of something, right? Well, whatever that something happens to be is usually different for most people. And so when you explain that not only to senior leadership, but to even the rank and file employees in an organization, it's important that you get something that is congruent with their daily work to be able to help you define that business case.
Yeah, I think one of the other challenges is when you say ROI, they're trying to do some sort of financial or accounting exercise to give you a net present value, positive sort of assessment against it, and to quantify the product development process or even an individual's participation in that, you're not necessarily it's not obvious how you're going to get that ROI, whether it's button click saved or time saved or easier access to this information. And so those old models don't necessarily apply to this. And so you kind of have to rethink it away and maybe allow it to be a little more subjective as far as your ability to advance through a product development process. Maybe at the macro level, you can ultimately identify some things, maybe get to market faster or the quality's higher or that sort of thing. But there's so many moving parts there that it's a challenge. So yeah, I think that kind of reinforces the senior level buy-in, sort of understanding that we're going to do this and we know we're going to get value even if we can't concretely say this is the value that we got.
Similar to what we talked about in our last webinar about this idea of trying to calculate this ROI, is that, and this business case, is not everybody arrives there in the organization at the same time, because it very well could mean that just as the case with any transformative change, is that you don't necessarily become more efficient right away. You don't necessarily become more profitable right away as people learn the new techniques, as they learn new processes. And in some cases, and certainly this idea of being a model-based enterprise or using model-based definitions is no exception in this case, is that even for some individuals in the organization, the business case could mean that they do a little more work, they incur a little more cost, but yet the benefits that others in the organization will reap from that reduce costs by so much or reduce work by so much that it either becomes a wash or outpaces the additional work or cost that someone else might experience.
Yeah, and just a small anecdote on that is I was at a conference a couple years ago, and I talked to some of the people that I worked with doing virtual design review rollouts, and we were able to look back on 20 years since that day or since that time, and he had something interesting to say in that he's like, you know what, Jim, since we've done this, we've actually had no buildability issues. Since we rolled this out, we've had no buildability issues. Well, that wasn't even on our radar back then. That would have been a manufacturing thing. We were in engineering. So how do you do an ROI on a reduction of buildability issues? That's probably something that you could do, but it was decades, after that fact that you came to that realization. So there was value there for sure.
So another thing to think about is often that, and sometimes this goes hand in hand with the use case though, is this or business case, excuse me, is the ability to identify a clear process. One of the challenges I think for any company, big or small, is to articulate their process and to define a process. And it seems as if the more people work in an organization, whether it be longer or in different roles, it seems as if what they would articulate as the process is usually not what's documented as the process. And so, and again, I kind of come back to that point about human nature, is that people, in many cases, what they actually do versus what they say they do are sometimes two different things. And so when a company is transitioning to being a model-based enterprise and using model-based artifacts in their processes, it is important that that process become clear. And if for no other reason than the kinds of technologies that are going to be used to create and to secure and to archive and to disseminate these digital representations are such that if you don't have a well-defined process and one that people buy into and that is well articulated to them, you very much risk having your transformation is hard anyway, but you risk having that further exacerbated by the implementation of these technologies than if you had a clear and well-defined process to begin with. A third thing to think about when transitioning to being a model-based enterprise, or one of the third challenges that comes up, is a lack of training. So, Jim, is that something that I'm sure you've seen in many cases, a lack of training? I mean, I certainly see it from my position within an educational environment, but a lack of training, I think, can take on many forms within an industry setting. And sometimes the tools are very capable, but people just don't know what to do with them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And let's just assume, first of all, that there's time to do the training. Everyone has a day job. And it's usually, an additional ask or request to allow some of their experts to be made available to do this sort of training. And that's just with maybe a point release of their existing tools. But when you actually are trying to do a strategic change, say into the model-based definition world, that's above and beyond a tool. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of working. And your expert in the old way may not be the expert in the new way. And so even how you do the training could materially impact the success of this, whether you bring in, is it a train the trainer, or do you bring in the experts from before to come in, see it, and if it doesn't resonate with them, they may go back and tell their chief program engineer, I don't know, it doesn't feel right, or it's very fragile during this transition, during this time, to get the right people in there to understand the concept, understand the strategy, and embrace it. Otherwise, you're at risk, because most of the SMEs there are well respected and well thought of, and just a couple words from them could derail the whole thing. And so, but putting that all aside, assuming the training is in place and it's structured the right way, and people get it and understand it and want to go forward with it and are ready to do it, this isn't exactly an easy thing to understand or an easy thing to implement or even to transition to. So it takes time, it takes patience. You have to be ready to do it, be ready to fail at it, and then try again and learn and do it again. And all of this is while the clock's ticking, while this company is still trying to make money. So it's with their existing process. So you do have to be patient and continue to try and get this thing going.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I would add to it is that transformation into a model-based enterprise using model-based approaches, model-based artifacts, it's a kind of a threefold transformation. You're transforming mindsets, you're transforming processes, and you're transforming your use of tools or technology. And one of those is hard enough, let alone three of them at what might arguably be the same time or very similar time frames. And so, to your point about not having time, that is, I think, absolutely accurate. And moreover, I would say, when you think about time and the inability to do training or the choice to not do training in favor of something else because you simply don't have time, when it comes to a point when you do have time, well, which one do you train on? Do you train on your mindset? Do you train on your use of the tools? Or do you train on your development and implementation of a process? They all three go together, and they all three take time. So which one do you arguably train on? I think in many respects, probably the easiest one and maybe the most straightforward one to train on is the tool set. And I would suggest that in some cases, getting people trained up on how to use tools that create or use the model-based definitions that are made, that certainly is important because, technology has come a long way in this particular area, and certainly computer-aided design systems from an authoring point of view, and many of the viewing applications, whether they be mobile or desktop based, again have certainly come a long way from when we first started this. But training on process and training on mindset are rather amorphous things to sort of train on, whereas training on a tool set is a very discrete and rather concrete, comparatively speaking, process or way in which to train somebody. And so, and in many respects, when we talk about a lack of training in this space, that's often what people will refer to as a lack of training in how to use the tools. But I would also suggest there's often a lack of training in mindset and in process as well, and that can be just as detrimental to the ability to transform as an organization, just as much, if not more so, than a lack of training on the tools.
Yeah, so then in order to entice a company to do this, you may often need bad times where your survivability is actually at stake. When it's clear that the old way is not working and it's working so badly that, or it's not working so badly that we may not be around anymore. And it takes that sort of a dynamic or environment to really get people to focus on a new way of doing things. Maybe one of the worst things that can happen is if everything's going great, the stock price is high, you may incorrectly think that the old way is fine and we're doing great, even though you in theory have time and money and everything else to look at new ways. Why? Because we're great, everything is fine. And so, not to say that the challenging time where there's no budget for anything to do anything, if your survivability as an entity is at stake, then people will tend to pay attention and try and make things better.
For sure, survivability puts things into much clearer focus sometimes.
Yeah.
And finally, and this kind of goes along with our third one, which was the lack of training. But basically, even if someone has been trained, sometimes companies, for a variety of different reasons, don't necessarily fully leverage the tools that they have. So our fourth one here is not fully leveraging the tools. And again, some of this is a mindset challenge from my experience. Some of it is a lack of training. Another challenge another aspect to this challenge is that many of the software tools that we have today in this space, they're very complex. Their menu structures are very deep. There's often more than one way to create whatever digital representation somebody might be trying to create. And so one of the challenges that people have in not fully leveraging the tools is they get sometimes overwhelmed by the fact that the tools are very broad and very deep, and it is at times difficult to come to consensus around what the best choice, arguably even the singular choice, might need to be for how a tool gets used in a certain application or in a certain environment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, and even when we say leverage, I mean utilizing. The tool could be extremely powerful because it's meant to cover our workflows or use cases for many, many, many different people. And some of those may be applicable to your world. It's just you haven't either didn't know, didn't take time to learn, or did learn and then forgot. I mean, half the tools I use on software, if I don't use them multiple times, I got to go relearn how to do it. And then it becomes do I do it the old way, or do I go learn it and then do it? And then you're kind of doing in your mind a comparison of the time it would take, and then you may know you're doing the suboptimal way because it probably saves you 5 minutes maybe to just do it the old way versus to go learn it the new way. And so, and again, I don't think it's not bad behavior necessarily. It's just trying to be pragmatic and do it this way and then go forward. Yeah, I mean, if you even think of looking at Excel, how powerful is Excel? Do you really need to drag down and do this, or could you do a macro to do it? Well, you could do a macro to do it. It would happen really, really fast. But you're always making these decisions of the tactical versus strategic sort of decision on your workflow to do things in a better way.
Yeah, and to build on that, I think as these technologies that we use in a model-based enterprise have evolved, sometimes our ways of thinking may or may not evolve in the same way. And, Jim, you just made the point about how sometimes you may have known something at one time, and then you haven't used it for a while, and so you forgot. And so you have to go relearn it. Well, the supporting and scaffolding structures from a training point of view to help people either learn the first time or relearn when necessary, the second or third or fourth or so on times, those are not always immediately available. And while I think the software development community has gotten better at creating help functions and online training and education products to support their tools, and even just in the help menu that is, commonplace in software tools today, many of the software companies in this digital enterprise space, in this model-based enterprise space, they'll embed tutorials and training materials right in that help menu. Well, again, first of all, one, you have to know that they're there, and two, you need to be able to go and use them. But aside even from information that's on a help menu, it's important to have other supporting structures, if at all possible, inside your organization, whether it be on-demand training, on-the-job training, subject matter and mentoring expert networks, whatever those may be in your organization. It's important to have those supporting sort of knowledge structures and knowledge environments to help you use the tools in the most effective way possible.
That's great. So as we're thinking about these things, we're as we step through, you've given us a lot to think about, and it's possible that some of our attendees might feel potentially overwhelmed, or there's a lot to think about. So if we are thinking about these barriers, we're thinking about some things that companies can do at a high level, some first steps. What are some recommendations and some first steps that you would make to an organization who's just wanting to start out in transforming to a model-based enterprise?
From my perspective, Rachel, I think one of the first things somebody has to do in any sort of a transformation experience is they first of all want to set some clear goals so that everyone is aware of what those are. And then they also, along with setting those goals, need to manage expectations around those goals to the point where the goals are not just clear, but they're also manageable and well understood. As we talked about before, this transformation is threefold: mindsets, processes, and tools. And so having clear goals and managed expectations, even in one of those areas, is difficult, let alone all three. But in as much as an organization is able to do so, they certainly need to try.
Yeah, I think that's clear. But the other part of it is if you're able to do this, is do the start with why. As opposed to just being legislated down, you need to explain to them, this is why we're doing this. We know there's inefficiency in how you're doing things, and we're going to try and make your life easier by doing this. Let them understand that you're being empathetic to their job, their workflows, their use cases, and we're doing this because we care about you and we want to make your life better at doing your job. And so I think if you can structure a message like that, then you're going to get a lot less resistance, a lot more buy-in at that level.
Yeah, I would certainly agree, Jim. One of the ways I think that we can get buy-in, so to speak, is having standards and associated with them processes that work for all concerned. We use in this community a lot this concept of, when you talk about creating 3D models, even before this concept of a model-based definition or a model-based enterprise was part of our lexicon as it is today, there was an awful lot of dialogue over the years, and still continues to be, about having standard ways of using the authoring tools to create these model-based representations. And whether it's standards in the sense of national or international standards, or whether it's just standards within your organization or within your work group, or even if the word standard implies a certain amount of formality, but even if it's even if your practice that you do doesn't necessarily rise to the level of formality of calling something a standard, it's important to have commonly understood and followed and well-defined ways of using the design tools and the authoring tools to create these model-based representations, and then ultimately a mechanism by which to enforce them, such that people are compliant. Unfortunately, in the design and manufacturing worlds we live in today, schedules are important, and I suppose they've always been important, but even more so today in a global environment where competition is not always known or well understood. There's a sense of urgency that surrounds time. Time to prototype, time to release, time to market, time to customer, all of those things, and doing or creating model-based information in an unstandardized way can very much have negative impacts on schedules, amongst many other things.
Yeah, I can think of a couple things here. It's kind of the golden rule. You may make a model. If we're talking about CAD modeling here in this case, there's some pretty yucky ways that you can do CAD models today that you have to think, if I was the person who was going to get this model later to base it off of a new design or to redo it, would I be happy or mad with myself for how I did it? And so it's really pragmatic thinking, and how did you build this? Did you build it the right way? I think most of this audience knows that when you load a model, it's not loading the model itself, it's actually traversing the steps that you went through to build that model. Well, if you look at that history and it's 1,000,000 miles long, you know that probably wasn't made in the most efficient way, or if it was just ad hoc, and it's not a sustainable sort of stable model that you have built. And so when you're talking about standards or modeling standards in that context, you want to build things and have them structured the right way and make good decisions as you made that model, so that it's easily editable later or easily reusable later. So as you also though think of, if you hear the terms digital twin, digital thread, and even digital lake. I hate the term digital lake because a lake is by default not structured, it's just a big mess of stuff that sort of works together in an ecosystem. But you're not going to leverage any of the benefits of digital thread, digital twin, unless you actually standardize and structure your information so that it's consumable, not just for you and your context, but for everyone else in a way that helps that information provide the value that it's meant to provide everywhere else. And so, again, at the end of the day, if I was to give this to someone else, would they be happy with it or would they not be happy with it? And it's really oftentimes just that pragmatic level of thinking that would make things really go up and down the thread in a nice way.
Yeah, I agree. So a third thing to think about in this larger discussion about ways to get started is starting with one particular business area. This could be a particular product, it could be a particular product line, maybe it's one component in a product. The level of detail, level of specificity, that's going to vary from one company to the next. But starting with something that is a rather bounded case and working towards completing the process, start to finish, on that particular item or set of items is one of the ways that I've seen companies be rather successful at doing this. It allows you to manage expectations well. It allows you to communicate expectations well. It gives you usually a known data set with representative and reasonable levels of complexity associated to it, so that you don't have to deal with too many variables at once. It also begins to give you a sense of how other parts of your organization may deal with these particular methods in their transformation as well.
Yeah, I agree with the one business area because you're not going to get it right the first time. Any tool, any process, there's going to be a regression to some level, and you have to be able to, as Nate mentioned, eliminate some variables so that you can focus in and try and find out what went wrong, how do we make it better, what went right, can we make that even better still. But that's a hard problem to solve if you do it across multiple businesses at the same time. Get it right, try and get the best practice, get some inertia going, and then roll it out in a way that's scalable, that's controllable. I mean, you have support teams that are also learning new things and new tools, and you don't want to over stress those support teams as well. I mean, everyone's on this together, so do what you can do in a contained way and then go forward.
Yeah, I agree. And then finally, we have this notion of ensuring accessibility, and this is something that sometimes people don't think about, because depending on how you interpret this, it could arguably be seen as the opposite of what we just suggested about putting boundaries around things. But the idea is that when you roll out the transformation, particularly in the way of the software and hardware tools that support it, ensuring accessibility of those tools to the people who need them in no more of a restricted way than is necessary, to maintain compliance or other kinds of things, is incredibly important. The other thing to remember is ensuring accessibility around the information as well as the tools, because remember, it's mindsets, it's processes, and it's tools. And accessibility also needs to be made to information, or to subject matter experts, or to process documentation. Unfortunately, I've seen instances in organizations in the past where you almost get this separation that happens where it's a scenario of the haves and the have-nots in a particular organization, and you end up in a scenario where those people who are part of this transformation in that group or that business unit are seen as the lucky ones or the fortunate ones, and the others who don't quite have those new tools and processes or other things are left to feel as left behind, or as second class, so to speak. And it's important if for no other reason than morale, when it's their turn to go through the transformation, that this is done that accessibility is done in a very positive fashion.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add there, except that they're sensitive. If you're doing a new process, a new tool, a new culture, new workflow, and you may also have new audiences who have never had access to this information before, they're learning everything brand new. And if you make it a challenge, or you make it harder for them, or they perceive it, I used to be able to walk over to my file cabinet, pull out this drawing, and I'd have it in under 10 seconds. Now you're making me log into the system and try and bring it down to my machine, and it takes 10 minutes. Well, they may now see the old way's better, and it would be a problem. And so you actually make sure that their experience, their interface is allowing them to see the value of this right away.
That's a really good point, Jim. I would just simply piggyback on that and say, while the technology very much can be an enabler to people getting work done in these environments, if you're not careful and it's not deployed well or correctly, it can very much be a disabler in how people get work done. And so while I've often said that sometimes the technology is the easier part of this, the technology and the tools, and sometimes it's the processes and the mindsets that are the hardest. Don't discount the amount of attention that the technology and the tools need, because if not deployed correctly or well or in a way that makes sense, it can very much disable the other two. A fifth thing here is trying to make these cultural changes, and we've begun alluding to this a little bit, is trying to make these cultural changes as smooth as possible. You know, often when companies deploy these technologies and these methods, it also means a certain change in the way that people work. And again, human nature, people don't necessarily like to change the way they work. They have ways that have worked for them. And you know, the point that Jim made earlier is that if people are happy and things are going fine and the company is successful, you know, one of the inevitable comments that's going to come is, well, why do we need to change this? Part of this is, and something that I've seen work successfully, is that part of it is about helping people understand that, you know, we don't just want the company to be around today. We want to get ahead of this sort of technological tsunami that is coming, and we want to get out in front of it in a way that gives us the needed time and the needed ability to not necessarily get it right the first time exactly, and to give us time to make those changes and to enculturate those changes in our organization.
Yeah, I mean, smooth culture change sounds easy to say, but not easy to do. What I think is important is that the entire company, everyone understands this is why we're doing this. We're doing it for you. We're doing it to make your life better. If many times throughout your day you're wondering, I did not go to college for this, then that means we are not doing things the right way to make you, to truly empower you to do why you went to college. And engineering space, again, the audience was going to know, but did you go to college to FTP or to export out or to change from this format to this format? No, you went probably to be an engineer and to design things or to do whatever your chosen career was, to do that, you know, to the utmost of your ability, not all this administrative stuff. So smooth cultural changes means that everyone's understanding, everyone helps shape, everyone's bought in, everyone is all in this together, so that we're really going to be able to empower us to do what we went to college for.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Absolutely. And, you know, thinking through, you know, we talked about how there are some cultural barriers and some things to think about from that perspective, but also, you know, thinking about these first steps to take. It's been really enlightening listening to the two of you talk. To kind of summarize what we've discussed today a little bit more broadly, a model-based enterprise really enables teams and organizations to get the information that they need and remove barriers to collaboration. And these can be particularly hefty barriers, especially when thinking about how to transform people, processes, and tools, either all at the same time or taking it one step at a time. We've also talked about how in order for businesses to successfully implement a model-based approach, they have to really clearly identify a business case and, you know, establish some really clear goals for their enterprise to know what they need to achieve. Talking about defining a clear process and establishing standards so that everybody can really be on the same page and talk the same language. Providing training in people, processes, and tools, but also kind of starting with one area, one spot, to kind of use almost as a pilot or a study to make sure that things are going well and that the transformation can happen really optimally. And then finally talking about fully leveraging tools to make sure that people who need the tools can access them, but also being able to access information at the same time. And how companies really need to consider internal expectations and cultural shifts at the same time that they think about technology implementation, and ensuring that organizational transparency across the whole organization can really empower everybody to make that transformation and to be on the same page. So we did get some questions from our audience today, and the first one kind of still stemming off from this idea of cultural change. We have a lot of new engineers that are being taught on model-based approaches, but our senior engineers are still using 2D. Neither side wants to change. What do you do in that situation?
I've seen this a couple of times in places that I have worked or in companies that I have visited and done work for. One of the first things that I try to communicate to people is that neither side is actually wrong. And it's, you know, the people who are more senior in the organization, they have a wealth, more than likely, of product knowledge and company knowledge. The people who don't have as much experience with the company, they are often some of the ones that might be more adept at using the technology and more comfortable with what that means in terms of ways of working. And one of the things that I have found that works particularly well is some sort of a mentorship scenario where you pair one of the more senior workers with one of the less senior workers, and you know, the two can ultimately learn from each other.
I completely agree with that. And also know that the old guard, they've probably seen a new initiative come in every year of their entire career. The younger, maybe this is their first one and they're excited, like, well, this is obvious. Why wouldn't we do this? This is perfect. And then, well, yeah, I know, but I've seen 29 of these over the course of my career. And so I agree with Nate that neither of them are wrong. It's just a matter of working together and breaking it down and looking where the value can be applied.
Great. Another question coming in. I've heard a lot about how model-based can help save time and money. What are some other benefits, both tangible and intangible?
So Rachel, from that perspective, I would say one that maybe more immediately comes to mind is either could be increases or it could be decreases depending upon what aspect of this particular metric that you're measuring. But the overall potential for a higher quality, lower defect product using model-based approaches tends to be better than without them. Now, that said, it does require a certain amount of technology adoption by various people in that value stream. It does require a certain amount of sticking with the adoption of those technologies or those methods and processes, but certainly the enhanced quality of products and information because of less ambiguity in the information to begin with is one of the other benefits I've seen.
Yeah, I think so. The structuring of that information, to give a specific example, would facilitate reusability. If a company has millions of parts, even more specifically, say a bolt, maybe the exact design that you're looking for, that for a bolt is in a drawing somewhere, but if it takes longer to go find that drawing and to see if it's going to be something that you could reuse or not, takes longer than it does to build a new bolt, they will tend to build a new bolt. And the model-based definition or framework will allow that search to happen much faster, much easier, more applicable. Ideally, it just drops right in their lap to say, oh, I'll just use this instead of building a new one. So to me, that those sort of things that they're on the hook for, by the way, they are meant to be reusing stuff, but they have to make this time analysis to say, I'll just do it, and then I'll deal with the consequences later. But these tools, this methodology will actually help that empower them to find reusable parts much faster.
One of the other things, Rachel, I would say that kind of goes along with both the things that Jim and I said was also the enhanced communication between companies and their suppliers, both up and down the supply chain. That unambiguous sense of information is incredibly important.
Okay. And one last question here. How can I articulate an ROI big enough for my executive team without focusing on one single department and including the supply chain?
That's a really interesting question, because one of the things that I've experienced is that while you can get very common, I'll say, numbers about the costs of, let's say, hardware and software, you can even in your own company distill the common sort of fully burdened hourly rate of an employee. But to fully roll this up into a convincing ROI for senior leadership or executive leadership to make a decision, one of the challenges people often run into is being able to accurately measure the time that has been saved in order to begin to equate that to dollars. But I think also one of the other things people run into is that, say for a moment they were able to get accurate and unambiguous information, sometimes the gains that are depicted are so much or so high that people begin to question whether senior leadership would believe these numbers or not.
Yeah, and I mean, you may have to make it as simple as understanding the senior leadership's use case in accessing this information and really kind of make it relevant to them. So let's say there's an engineering change that's sitting on a chief program engineer's desk to approve or not approve. How long does it take you? How do you get awareness of it? How do you engage? What do you do when you know there's a problem? And if all that means I got to go, oh, I'll see it, but I'm out of the office, I'll come back, I'll open my machine, I'll load all this information, or I'll make everyone come into a room and explain it to me. And does the model-based definition use case allow you to see that engineering request or engineering change in an easier way, maybe on your device? Maybe you don't have to wait forever. You get all of the relevant information presented to you in a way that gives you what you need to say yes or no. And then what time did we save? You didn't call a meeting with 10 people who had to be in there for an hour to explain to you what was going on. So that's 10 hours plus your hour. That's 11 hours. So maybe you can do it that way to make it irrelevant against their use case, and then it resonates more. To say we save, to try and do mouse clicks or those sort of things, that's just not going to hit home with the senior manager often.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. If you had a question and we didn't get to answer it today, we will follow up with you directly. The panel discussion today will be available on demand, and we will send out the link to everybody who joined the webinar today. And you will see that come from us tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.